Hello there, good evening, and welcome to Spectrum's Alternative Election Debate. Whether you're watching on YouTube, Google+, or on our website, spectrumdebates.com, you are very welcome. Tonight we have guests representing 5 of the biggest parties in Great Britain in what is the least predictable general election in decades. They will each be giving an opening and closing statement and answering questions submitted by you using the hashtag SDAED, that's Spectrum Debates Alternative Election Debate. You can follow that hashtag on Twitter for more discussion. If you are watching on Google+, and we have just tweeted the link, you can also use the Applause app there, which is our version of The Worm that you will have seen on many other shows. And of course at 9 PM over on spectrumdebates.com, a poll is launched which will ask you who your favourite debater from tonight was. Tonight, of course, is a little bit different because our panellists, whilst not here in any official capacity, are going to be speaking on behalf of their parties rather than discussing issues in general. That's how we're going to be doing our alternative election debate, and without further ado, let me introduce you to them. Our first guest is Harry Samuels, who is speaking on behalf of the Liberal Democrats. Our second guest is John Mousley. He is speaking on behalf of UKIP. Our third guest, Christopher Keane, is here on behalf of the Scottish National Party. Then it's Leon French, who is speaking on behalf of the Conservatives. And last but by no means least, it's Lily Jane Summers, who is speaking on behalf of the Labour Party. My name is Gareth. I am a Conservative, but for full disclosure, of course, that's why I'm telling you that. I'll do my best to play devil's advocate and challenge all of our guests tonight and explore every idea and question that you have given us. So, without further ado, we're going to begin with our first speaker, who will give us an opening. I'll then set them a question, and then we'll move on to our second one. Our first statement tonight comes from Harry Samuels on behalf of the Liberal Democrats. Harry.
Thanks, Gareth. If you were to go out onto the street and ask people to distill their principles down into a few words, you'd probably hear the same sort of things. Justice, fairness, opportunity. Most parties would probably say the same. But for the past 5 years, it's been notable that only one has been putting these principles into effect. The Liberal Democrats are exactly what it says on the tin, liberal. We believe in empowering individuals by helping the most vulnerable in society first. We believe in sensible economic policy and progressive social policy. It was the Lib Dems, for example, who pushed through the tax cuts for the poorest over the past Parliament, while the Tories decided to cut taxes for the richest first. It was the Lib Dems who unashamedly focused on public services like education, introducing the pupil premium, and pilots for free school meals for all children. And it was the Lib Dems who focused and invested in renewable energies and the environment, while the Tories tried to tear us down. But that was then. We're proud of our achievements, but it's time to look to the future. The Tories want to cut £12 billion from welfare, from the most vulnerable. Labour want to frivolously spend and put taxes up and bed down with the SNP. UKIP would introduce xenophobic venom into the heart of government. The Lib Dems say no. We want mental health funding increased drastically. We're unashamedly in favour of internationalism in the EU. We want action on the deficit which doesn't cripple us. And we want a digital bill of rights to fundamentally constitutionalise our abilities online and to stop government snooping. There are more policies which you'll hear about over the evening, but that's just a taster. And if justice, fairness and opportunity are the abiding principles of the British public, it is only the Liberal Democrats who represent that in politics. Thank you.
Can't hear you, Gareth.
I'm so sorry. I've done something with the sound here. Harry, the first question to you is this. The Lib Dem campaign that you just mentioned promises to put the heart into the Conservatives and the brain into Labour. But surely this campaign's not going to persuade anyone, because Labour voters would think you're heartless for going in with the Tories, and Tories would think you're brainless for going in with Labour. So really, what is the point of the Lib Dems?
The point of the Lib Dems is very simple. This campaign about look left, look right, then cross, or putting the heart into the Tories and the brains into Labour is very simple. We're the only party who has pursued and enacted social change and progressive social reform while at the same time keeping a sensible hand on the tiller of the economy. We're the only party who decided to put into place action on the deficit with sensible policies that weren't focused on cutting away from the most vulnerable, and rather we wanted a more balanced approach, which we still do. And we're the only party who not only would put in the future the amount into the NHS which is needed in a positive way, unlike the Conservatives, but who would also enact compassionate things while not wrecking the economy. So we are the best of both worlds. That is what liberalism is. It is empowering the least empowered by looking at the bottom first, rather than completely messing everybody over like Labour would do, or just a pell-mell of things helping the top first, like the Conservatives. We want to empower the least empowered first. That is what liberalism encompasses, and that's why the Liberal Democrats are very much still relevant in this country.
Thank you very much indeed, Harry. Our next guest who's going to open is for the Labour Party, and it's Lily Jane Summers. Lily.
Thanks, Gareth. Personally, I don't think those who are most vulnerable are going to be empowered by the VAT rise and the welfare cuts that we've had after the coalition government. But for the next part, Labour Party wants to offer something different. In terms of the economy, we've made some noticeable improvements in terms of jobs, in terms of growth, but we need to go further than that. In terms of the specific jobs, we need to have high-wage jobs, valued jobs, sustainable jobs. We need to have the economy grown so we can reduce the deficit. And one of our main focuses for the next parliament, which we laid out right at the start in terms of our budget responsibility lock, is actually reducing the deficit in the most sustainable way, and eventually, hopefully, by the end of the parliament, eliminating the deficit as soon as we can and reducing the national debt. On the NHS, we need to reverse the privatisation under the coalition government. We need to invest in the NHS with £2.5 billion. Boosting the NHS with 8,000 more doctors. We need to make sure we focus more on mental health. On the environment, we need to actually make huge improvements on climate change. In terms of democracy, we need to set up a constitutional convention, give 16 to 17-year-olds a vote. The Labour Party is all about, making huge improvements, because, quite frankly, under the Conservatives, we've made some improvements on the economy, but we've got so much more to go, quite frankly. So,
thank you very much, Lily. My question to you is this. Labour's manifesto, as you mentioned, opens with a promise to reduce the deficit, but then it goes on to produce greater spending and borrowing plans. Now, Labour spent 5 years condemning the coalition, but rarely, according to the SNP, voting against austerity measures, whilst offering no different ideas about how to reduce spending and cut the deficit. As the IFS said, nobody knows what voting Labour means, and they're right, aren't they?
Well, not really. First of all, what do you mean by increased spending and increased borrowing? What specifically are you mentioning? Regarding the SNP, we didn't vote for £30 billion in cuts. We voted to, get the current budget into surplus, which we will do under our plans. Gareth, we have made numerous plans for cuts in our manifesto, but it's all about reducing the deficit in a sustainable way, growing the economy, bringing down the deficit more sustainably, investing in our infrastructure. And regarding Labour criticising the Tory cuts at the beginning, I think that was actually right, because the main point here is, Gareth, you shouldn't cut the economy when the economy is actually decreasing. You should make cuts and increase taxes and reduce the deficit when there's actual growth in the economy. And that's what we're happening now. Growth is actually in the economy, so it is right at the moment to gradually cut spending, but it wasn't right at the beginning, because as we saw, we had 2 years of no growth and the deficit hardly going down at all.
Thank you very much indeed. Lily, our next speaker opening up for UKIP is, where has he gone? Oh, there he is on my screen. I couldn't find him. It's John Mousley. Off you go.
Thank you, Gareth. Thank you, everyone else, for turning up. It's such a good thing to have debates in politics, especially in this day and age where we have so many choices in our country. Firstly, I think it's safe to say we live in very difficult times for this country. There's a huge problem not only with the deficit but with debt, with social mobility, and the fact we are facing an ever more dangerous world. I think something you can do is fair and balanced solution to these problems. We have produced our widest range manifesto in our party's history. As well as this, we have independently costed this manifesto, unlike several of the other parties represented here. So we are not afraid to seek help from outside our party to find the best way forwards. I think that's something that perhaps puts us apart from the other parties. We are not blind to the fact that it's good to seek help and to believe in the people of Britain to make the best decisions.
Thank you very much indeed, John. My question to you is this. Believe in Britain is what your policy, your manifesto states on the front, yet that same manifesto wants to withdraw us from the European Union whilst remaining in the free trade areas. Now, those free trade areas subject us to EU law still. So why does UKIP think that Britain, in which you believe, should be subject to laws that you don't believe we should have any say on?
I would answer that question quite simply. When we trade with other countries that are outside the EU, for example, America or China, we are subject to their trade laws. Why should it be any different that we expect to trade somewhere and not obey the standards there? The point with the EU is it is heading to something beyond a trade agreement. We in UKIP are very happy to see a trade agreement and us be forced to obey laws that allow us to trade with others because that's good for this country. But to have something beyond that, I think, is a step too far. And I believe not only UKIP, but the majority of Britain now believes that.
Thank you very much indeed, John. Our next guest to give an opening is on behalf of the Conservatives, and it's Leon French. Off you go, Leon.
Hello. Firstly, can I open a bit differently and just say I've actually been quite nervous about this because I'm actually going up against some very good debaters who know the stuff. So, firstly, thank you everyone for turning up and debating, and thank you to everyone who's watching. It should be a really good debate, I reckon. I think this election, it's not a choice about two different people, David Cameron or Ed Miliband. We don't live in a presidential system. This is a choice, really, about whether we go back to the failed Labour policies of more borrowing, more spending, more debt, or we go forward with our long-term economic plan. We've had endorsements from the chief of the IMF, Christine Lagarde, saying that we've been doing well. Barack Obama said we must be doing something right. The German finance minister said we must be doing something right. So, as I say, really this election is a stark choice because, frankly, I have to be honest, the Lib Dems are going to get slight irrelevance in this. It's between Labour, who idolise the policies of socialist France, which have not long since been gotten rid of by socialist France, or we carry on with the plan that we put forward, and we carry on with more jobs, more growth. Thank you.
Lovely. That was exactly a minute. Thank you very much, Leon. My question to you is this. In the last couple of weeks, the Conservatives have offered to double free childcare, cut income tax, freeze rail fares for 5 years, and spend $8 billion extra on the NHS every year. When did the Conservatives give up on the idea of being any good on the economy?
I don't think we haven't given up on being any good with the economy, because it's not as if we're just throwing money at things. We're carrying on with our fiscal consolidation that we started off with 5 years ago, along with the Liberal Democrats, who very kindly went along with us. I don't think at all that we've given up on the idea of running an economy well. We've just realised that as we get increased growth and whatnot, we can afford these things. I think what it also proves is that we have both a head and a heart as well. And your sound's gone.
I keep pressing the wrong button here. Thank you, Leon. Our final guest at our opening tonight is on behalf of the SNP, and it's Christopher Keane. Off you go, Chris.
Thanks, Gareth. In some ways, I agree with Leon. Elections are when we choose what direction we're going to go in as a country. And in this election, we have a clear choice between a future of more cuts, more austerity, more suffering for the poorest in our society, or a future where we take a different direction, where we protect our public services, our most vulnerable people, our society. A vote for any of these other parties, Labour, Lib Dems, Tories, UKIP, will mean more of the same. A vote for the SNP is a chance for a real change. The SNP will end the obscenity of nuclear weapons in the UK. We'll scrap the hated bedroom tax. We'll protect our beloved NHS. We can do all of this if we make sure that we have enough seats to hold the balance of power. It needs the SNP to keep Labour honest in this next Parliament. We won't just protect Scottish interests. We will act in favour of all the people across the UK and ensure everyone has a government that will protect the interests of the people. Only the SNP will deliver real change.
Thank you very much indeed, Christopher. Here's my question for you. The SNP has painted itself as being to the left of Labour, and you yourself just talked about protecting the poorest in our society. Yet in Scotland, the SNP, for example, has slashed college places for everyone to fund free university education for the wealthy. Isn't the SNP in reality just a single-issue party?
Well, Gareth, I think it's very foolish to imply that university is just for the rich. We've seen in Scotland that we have a greatly improved social mobility now, with more people from the poorest parts of society going to university. And of course, it's much easier for them in Scotland because they don't have to face crippling debts from tuition fees, the kind that were brought in by Labour and increased by the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. Of course, we'd like to see greater spending in Scotland, but we have to remember that the Holyrood's budget is ultimately set by Westminster through the Barnett formula. So we have to deal with the cuts that the UK send onto our budget. The SNP is not just a single-issue party. There are 8 years of government in the Scottish Parliament. We have shown that we can govern a wide variety of issues and deliver real change for Scotland that improves the lives of everyone in the country.
Thank you very much indeed, Chris. Thank you to all of you. Some fantastic comments and questions coming in online already. Let's try and put those points to our guests as we go through. Whichever one of you is throwing your laptop around, if you could try not to do it, that would be very, very helpful. But let's begin with the first question to all of you, and it is this. And it comes from Joshua Kerridge, at Joshua Kerridge1. Do you feel that the parties such as UKIP and the SNP are becoming more popular because actually there's very little difference between Labour and the Conservatives anymore? And I'm going to go to one of those parties to start with. John.
In a way, yes. If I could use a specific example of this, I think on political reform especially, there has been perhaps not uniform agreement amongst the Liberal AbCon, but there's definitely been large amounts of agreement. We see the right of recall bill being hacked up, so the power is put in the hands of the whips. We see both the Labour and Tories saying how much they love first past the post, despite them getting a lower and lower share of the national vote each election. So I think the SNP and UKIP are being helped by an anti-establishment feeling caused by Labour, Tories and the Lib Dems being more and more the same. But I don't think it's just that. I think there are genuine policies UKIP and sometimes the SNP put forward that are very good and encourage people to vote for them on merit, not just out of anger.
Thank you, Chris. The SNP has experienced a tremendous surge in popularity in Scotland recently. Isn't that really because you're the only alternative to what many people in Scotland see as being the Lib Lab Con, dare I use that phrase that John just used?
Well, yes, Gareth. I think especially in the aftermath of the independence referendum, when we saw a very sustained campaign where Labour, the Conservatives, the Lib Dems, and UKIP were all on the same page. The Scottish people increasingly see what is the difference. Even whether it's Labour, Conservatives, Lib Dems, they're all proposing, in different ways, but they all want more cuts, more austerity. Where is the real choice coming from? Where is the party that will say, we've had enough cuts, we've had enough austerity, it's time to have a government that will act in the interests of people, not looking out for bankers and big business. That is why I think so many people are put off these old parties now. It's time for a change, and none of these old parties are going to deliver change.
And let me just pick you up on that on one brief point, if I may, Chris, because it was a fairly simple question that I gave you. Are you not the only alternative to Labour in Scotland? Doesn't that mean basically you're able to say anything and do anything right now? I mean, you're standing on a platform in the general election that is pretty contrary to what the SNP's been doing in government in Scotland. Looking at the budget deficit you've got, you've not raised taxes despite the fact that you have the ability to do so, and yet you call for taxes to be raised on certain groups of people. The SNP's rhetoric doesn't actually follow how it's governed, does it? And aren't you pulling the wool over an awful lot of people's eyes?
Well, Gareth, again, you go on about tax-raising powers. What we have is a ability to very slightly change the basic tax rate in Scotland. These aren't the kind of powers that we consider important. We want powers over control, things such as corporation tax, being able to bring in higher bands of income tax. These are the things that the SNP would be looking to do through Westminster. These aren't a case of being able to use what we have in Scotland. What we have in Scotland at the moment is very limited powers, and of course the SNP exists to ensure Scotland gets maximum powers, it gets independence. In terms of your question, you're saying that the SNP is somehow being hypocritical. I think we've been making the best of the situation in Scotland because ultimately our budget's set from outside. You only have to look at the fact that we contribute more per head in tax to the rest of the UK than any other part of the UK does. So we should be ultimately looking to look after our own interests. But, as you say, we've had a referendum and Scotland's chosen to remain part of the UK. So we're going to get involved in UK politics, and the way to do that is to look to form a coalition government which we can get involved, have a say, and make sure that we get our policies enacted.
Thank you. Lily, the question, of course, is that aren't you basically the same as the Conservatives, and that's what's going to kill off your party in Scotland?
Well, first of all, just to respond to Christopher, you said you wanted maximum powers, but maximum powers would mean £7.6 billion in additional spending cuts or tax rises. So I'm not too sure if that's exactly what the poorest in Scotland really need right now.
That's not actually
to answer your question direct, Gareth, I would say yes or no, because I would say yes because there are some similarities between the Labour Party and Conservative, and for instance, one of the attractions of Nicola Sturgeon is that she's a woman. Ed Miliband's a man, David Cameron's a man. Both went to Oxbridge, PPE. They seem exactly the same, but there are important differences as well, Gareth. We want to have the minimum wage £8 an hour by 2019. We want to get rid of the bedroom tax. We want to protect the education budget. We want to protect police numbers on the ground. There are important differences. The Labour Party does need to go further, obviously, but I'd say yes or no. There are some similarities, but I wouldn't go down the road of the SNP saying there's huge differences. There isn't. And the SNP have been in power for 8 years in Scotland. So let's not pretend that the Scottish nationalists, this new independent force, they've never been in power. They want so much change. So that's what I would say, Gareth.
Can I just pick up on something here, Lily? Because it sounds like you were saying really one of the only reasons that the SNP is popular is because they've got a woman who's leading them.
No, that's just one example. That's just one example. What people would point out, for example, I'm mentioning directly in terms of the debate. Nicola Sturgeon is a fresh voice. Ed Miliband, David Cameron. I can understand what they're saying. There's very similarities between Ed Miliband and David Cameron, and Nicola Sturgeon is completely different.
Now, how come Labour is unable, in its heartland of Scotland, a place where normally it can bank on at least 40 seats or more, it could well be facing a complete white? What is wrong with your party and your manifesto hasn't been able to connect with your heartland? What's One Nation about this?
I would say that too far. I think for the first reason, the Scottish Labour has been very complacent. I think one of the problems that we haven't really realised until Jim Murphy's trying to... We haven't had that much organisation. We've been very complacent. We haven't given a real reason for the Scottish people to vote SNP. So I think you've got organisational problems. We need to go more left-wing in Scotland. We need to have more devolution. There is a multitude of problems, Gareth. But also, I think one of the most important things is regards to the referendum. I think if Scotland actually would have gone independent, they would have voted yes to independent. I don't think there would have been this SNP surge. I think, it's very much a reaction. And plus, they benefited from the activists in the Scottish independence referendum. And we haven't had that, Gareth. We haven't had those boots on the ground that the SNP do.
Thank you. Now, Harry, in all of this sort of conglomeration of parties coming together and looking exactly the same, the Liberal Democrats are an enabler, aren't they? I mean, this is what your party wants. You want all the parties to be so close together, you can all form a coalition and be happy and cosy. Aren't the Liberal Democrats responsible for killing politics?
I have no idea where you got that from, Gareth. I know that certainly I, as a Liberal Democrat, believe very strongly in the principles of liberalism, surprisingly, which underpin our party. And I think, going back to your original question about the little difference between Labour and the Conservatives, and as an avid Politico, I personally would disagree. I think there are vast differences between Labour and the Conservatives. But I agree with Lily in saying that there are differences which people generally don't perceive between them. And this is the thing that people are constantly missing. Because yes, you've got this sort of imperceptible difference between Labour and the Conservatives, but there is an alternative which is not cloaked in uncertainty. You know, there is this third way, which people seem increasingly unwilling to listen to just because of the record of the past 5 years, which I stand by. But you know, you have all of these parties offering similar policies, but you have no party that's offering a digital bill of rights like the Liberal Democrats. You know, we're the only party offering protections from state snooping. No party is offering a massive upscaling of mental health funding like the Liberal Democrats are. No party has done something towards electoral reform and is continuing to promise it. We're proposing proportional representation in our manifesto and House of Lords reform. No party which is feasible is proposing these things in its manifesto. And we are not these people that are funded by big businesses or trade unions or bankers.
Yeah, but that's
we are
because
funded
no one
by
wants to give you
individual
any money,
grassroots
isn't
groups.
it? I mean, that's the reason, that's because no one wants to give the Liberal Democrats money. That's the only reason why. Just thinking upon those points of yours, Harry, you talk about House of Lords reform, proportional representation, and so on and so forth. Every single one of those reforms, doesn't that actually force parties closer together, makes it more into this amorphous, to use the phrase, lib-lab-con blob, so that people will be increasingly find it increasingly difficult to tell the difference between you because you're all having to compromise on everything all the time. How is that going to be good for politics?
Well, very simply, in that if the people vote in certain numbers for a certain party, the people should get that representation. The current system cripples our democracy just because we somehow see as preferable a system where we have what we call a strong government. Well, I don't call it a strong government, I call it an elective dictatorship. I think it is better if parties work together, and better if we have a compromise that is generally agreed to, than we have one party going all on its sort of guns and not fulfilling what the people want. And just on principle, I think it is absolutely unconscionable that we have a party that can win and have a prime minister with 36-37% of the vote, when ostensibly 64-63% have voted against that party. You know, we cannot have that system anymore. We have to have reform. This election is going to prove it, just like the last election. And the Liberal Democrats are the only party who are feasibly offering this reform right now.
Thank you. Now, Leon, the Conservatives have changed radically in the last few years, haven't they? I mean, many people in UKIP would say that Cameron has destroyed what was a Conservative party. And this election manifesto of yours is now trying to steal Labour's clothes entirely, with billions and billions sprouted around. Is this not exactly the reason why people are no longer trusting parties? Because, you know, you call yourselves the Conservatives, but you're not, are you?
Well, UKIP would say we've gone lefty, communist, all this, that and the other. Labour would say we're really right-wing. I think I remember Harry once saying that we've gone far to the right. I think when you've got people saying that we've gone both left and right-wing at the same time, I think you're probably doing something right. Could you just repeat the last part of that question again, because I've completely forgotten what you said.
I mean, in what sense are you even a Conservative party anymore?
Oh, sorry, that was it.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're thinking about things like gay marriage and whatnot, I think there are some very conservative arguments for same-sex marriage, I should call it. Basically, Conservatives believe in marriage as an institution. There's nothing wrong with extending that to other people. I think that strengthens marriage, it strengthens family, and it strengthens society. So there are some very conservative arguments in favour of a lot of the things we've done. But if I can just address a couple of points that have been made. Christopher, you said, I'm sure you said something about the quote-unquote Lib-Lab-Con together, we're working together when it came to the independence referendum. Well, that's because we all happen to be unionist parties. There's nothing nasty and all samey about that. We just happen to be unionist parties, and we really always have been. I know Labour has a Republican group, but I think, if I remember rightly, there were some Labour activists who were campaigning for independence, but I can't quite remember. But there's nothing evil about that. I just think, just because the parties are perceived to be the same, it doesn't actually make them. Because, and I'm just going to say it, the electorate is not always right. And I know that's controversial for people to say in politics, because we're meant to listen to everything the electorate says. But the electorate is not always right. And I think the growth in social media getting involved in politics will really... I think it will make that worse. We've seen it before with really bad memes and things like that, which apparently they purport to show that MPs only ever turn up for debates and votes that affect them, and they'd never turn up for anything that affects everything else. The Spectator did a fantastic piece on it.
Leon, I'm sorry. I'm going to pull you in here because you've done a very good job of trying to avoid the point of actually your party calls itself one thing, but you're not anymore. Let me give you a particular point. Okay, well, let me give you a particular point. I'd like to answer it for. You've spent these 5 years talking about economic competence, making sure that your focus is on getting the deficit down. Yet we have no idea how you're going to fund this extra £8 billion that was plucked out of the air for the NHS. Isn't that exactly what you have condemned the Labour Party for over the last several years? And here you are doing it 3 weeks before an election.
No, but again, I don't think there's anything unconservative about putting money into the NHS. I think essentially what we're then saying, are we saying that the governments of what's his face? I've forgotten his name. Harold Macmillan, who was One Nation Tory, put a lot of money into public services and whatnot, and not Harold Wilson, he was Labour, wasn't he? The other one, I've forgotten his name, Edward Heath. He's always been accused of not being a proper Conservative. This happens all the time. The Conservative Party, whenever it goes along the necessary changes that it has to go on, which is what conservatism is always also about, we get accused of not being conservative. It's happened since the birth of the party, and it will keep happening, but it's rubbish.
Thank you. John, you opened this topic, and so I'm going to give you a brief moment to close it if you want.
Not to make UKIP seem too like the other parties, but Harry especially mentioned that no one else was offering greater funding for mental health, reform of the electoral system, and reform of political system generally. And I couldn't help but think that sounded awfully familiar, and it's because I'd read it in our manifesto.
Thank you very much. Thank you all very much for your comments. There have been many, many comments on Twitter, and some absolutely cracking ones. Unfortunately, I'm not going to get round to many of them today. I've had some great questions submitted, and we're about to move on to our next one. Now, this one comes from Guy Hollidge at the Earl _ GH, and the question is this. With the NHS being threatened by TTIP, what will your party do to protect it from privatisation? And Leon, on the randomiser, you have come out as answering this one first.
Well, it's already protected from privatisation. TTIP is, or TTIP, whatever you want to call it, it's no threat to the NHS. There are provisions in TTIP that stop public services like the NHS from being put into this deal. I'm sorry, but it's a bit of a non-question. It's not threatened with privatisation.
Thank you. Then let me go to Lily for Labour.
I think the NHS has a huge risk of being privatised, especially under TTIP, because in relation to TTIP, with the NHS included, which we don't know because the EU won't allow us to look at the negotiations, if it actually goes through, big businesses can actually sue the NHS for threatening their profit margins, for threatening their profits. So as I'm aware, Labour would actually, wouldn't sign the trade agreement with the United States if the NHS is included. So I do think the NHS is at a huge risk, especially with the NHS involved and big corporations involved. And it's a huge risk specifically, Gareth, that we're not allowed to look at the negotiations. So.
Thank you. Harry.
The TTIP The Liberal Democrats support TTIP as part of our commitment to internationalism and forging world trade opportunities with the rest of the world. But what we have said is in our manifesto, it's very clear. We have ensured that the member states' rights to provide public services publicly with no interference from private companies has been enshrined in the agreement. So the Liberal Democrats in government have created a situation where TTIP will go through, so furthering our commitment to international trade, but we, Liberal Democrats in government, have created an absolute stop on it, which means that public services will not be sold off.
John?
Well, it's interesting to see. We all broadly agree that the NHS is a good thing to be free, and all the parties here are promising extra funding to it. On TTIP specifically, it does put my party in a slightly difficult position, as we have always been very pro-free trade, and the UK being a trading nation, it should be good. However, TTIP is being negotiated largely in secret by European Commissions, which we have no control over. So UKIP in government would want to see us personally negotiate a US-UK trade deal that would ensure that our public services remain public, and we wouldn't go along the route of allowing the EU Commission to negotiate on behalf of our institutions.
Thank you. And finally, Christopher.
Well, I mean, I agree largely with Lily and John here. It's, the whole TTIP negotiation process has been so flawed and untransparent, I'm inclined to think we should throw the entire process out at this point. Much again, Lily mentioned, it's not just a matter of the NHS, there's a huge number of dangerous clauses included in TTIP. We have the potential for corporations to sue the government for any action that could dent their profits. You know, anything such as raising the minimum wage, the government could be technically forced to pay up the difference for that. I think the whole, I'm not against the concept of international trade, but I do think that we have to be much more careful for looking after our public services and not just bow down to this global tide of never-ending neoliberal reforms until we're at this race to the bottom. We'll have no services left, and it'll be a man against man economy.
Thank you. A few comments from Twitter. First of all, let me just point out that I think it's quite remarkable. We had an issue there which mentioned the phrase NHS privatisation, and every single one of our guests kept to the main part of the question about TTIP. So that's impressive and something for those politicians at home perhaps to note. A few of the comments people have made here. Salman Anwar at S_Anwar95, exactly right. TTIP poses no danger to the NHS. It's a complete lie to say that it does. William Brown at W_O_Brown. Privatisation is fine as long as the NHS continues to provide the best care available, is cheap for the taxpayer, and is free to use. Alessia at Upon a Cloud. Listening to Harry, you'd think the Lib Dems were a majority this time round. Chris G at _0. Labour manifesto says, we support the principles behind the negotiations on the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership Treaty. Harry, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, so while we definitely have this guarantee that the NHS is not going to be sold off as part of TTIP, it is interesting to hear all of the stuff that's going on about its opaque negotiation methods, and it's all being done in secret. And John alluded to something about the fact that it's being done sort of behind closed doors by people we didn't elect. This is stuff that a lot of Liberal Democrats believe, is that it should be more open, and it should be more transparent, and it should be more democratic. But the way to get more democracy in the EU isn't to throw our toys out of the pram and leave, it is to fight for more democracy in the EU. John, for example, said that it's a scandal that EU commissioners aren't elected. I agree, they should be elected. So why not have a direct election for the president of the EU Commission? These are things that Liberal Democrats would do to reform the EU from within. And
let me put that point straight to John. Come on, John, you believe in
I admire Harry.
If we elected the Council of Ministers or the Commissioners directly.
I admire Harry so much for his fighting spirit. I would just question him, what democratic reforms all the pro-European parties have managed in the... How many years, decades has it been we've been members of the EU now? Tony Blair, the huge reformer for EU, and also hugely pro-EU. Some say he even wants to be European president. I mean, what massive reforms did he manage for us? At this stage, to pretend there is any chance of us reforming the EU democratically is to be willfully blind. I mean, only yesterday we saw David Cameron's amazingly moderate reforms be uniformly rejected by everyone of significance in the European Union. To say, I am pro-European and I will make the EU democratic is a noble aim. I don't.
Why not try then?
Because you'll fail. We've failed in the past, and to waste time and effort failing as the UK economy is dragged down by this failing artificial state is pointless.
Just such a pessimistic view of the future. I just can't subscribe.
It's a pessimistic view of history.
Okay, gentlemen, we may come back to the European issue later. I just wanted a little bit of a point on that. But let's think about the NHS. Let's think about that wider topic, because we know it's something that's of great concern to the voters. Now, Leon, your party's been in charge of the NHS for 5 years. I remember the manifesto last time. It said there will be no top-down reorganisation of the NHS. Can you tell me why there was then a top-down reorganisation of the NHS?
Just there was. I'm not going to lie to you. I don't particularly have an answer for that. I'm not au fait on issues surrounding the NHS. But on this wider subject of NHS privatisation, can I just ask what people actually mean by the word privatisation? I think it's used as a sort of scare word. I'm not saying I support NHS privatisation. What I do support is the best system possible where it's not at critical point of delivery. That's the phrase. I think when people start talking about NHS privatisation, because the P word is a very dirty word in Britain, I think what they mean is they want to turn the debate so that we're either fully socialised care in the NHS or we go with the American system. Frankly, if we want to have a proper debate on privatisation in the NHS, it's nonsense, but that's how it always ends up going. So I want to know what people actually mean when they say privatisation. If you do mean carrying your credit card or debit card in when you go into A&E, please just say that if that's what you mean by it.
This is a problem with Labour, isn't it, Lily? Because over the last couple of years, I mean, for quite a long time, the Labour Party of this Parliament have had no policies. And so what they've done a lot is hang out the NHS privatisation bogeyman. The Labour Party knows full well that no British government would ever get away with turning it into an American-style health system, and yet that is the threat that keeps being bandied around by Labour, isn't it? Isn't that deeply irresponsible?
Why wouldn't no party privatise the NHS, Gareth? Of course, a party can privatise the NHS. They wouldn't be completely honest about it. And if you look at the Health and Social Care Act, Lansley Bills, got rid of the responsibility of the Jeremy Hunt role to look after the NHS. I mean, it's great. It's not instant like we're selling off the NHS, obviously, but you can quite clearly see that the private the market is gaining more and more control of the NHS. And what is actually happening is that the government is restricting funding to certain providers, and therefore they won't have the money, and they have to therefore outservice it to the market. So my point here is, Gareth, and the Labour parties, is that you are seeing the market having more and more control, and under the Conservatives you had the top reorganisation in the NHS, which they said they wouldn't, closures of shoreside centres. Essentially, you're seeing it very gradually, Gareth, and the Conservatives have been very, very disingenuous, and it's something that they were disingenuous about the healthcare reforms.
Sorry, Lily, isn't the real disingenuity here coming from the Labour Party? Because of all of the parts of the NHS that are run by private operators, and I'll use that neutral phrase, it was amounting to something like 4.5% of the NHS in 2010, and all of that came under Labour, and it's now gone up to about 5.5%. So why is increasing 4.5 percentage points good, increasing 1 percentage point bad?
I've never said that 4.5% is good, Gareth. I've never said it was good.
But it was
shouldn't have happened after,
wasn't it? So why?
I've never said that was a good thing. I've never said that was a good thing. The Labour Party did start it off, Gareth. I'm not going to deny that. But the point is, the Conservatives have been more disingenuous about it in terms of restricting funding to the NHS and then forcing those providers to go to the market. And as you saw in the healthcare reforms, Gareth, you're removing the responsibility of the health minister for the NHS. So they're doing it in a more disingenuous way, and I'm also saying that the 4.5% isn't acceptable either.
Thank you. Harry?
I just find it quite sort of discomforting when you hear the Conservatives and Labour squabbling over sort of 1% of privatisation. I think that what people care about is that if they fall ill, they can go to A&E and they can be treated. Or if they fall ill, they go to a hospital where there are enough doctors and enough treatment to help them. And the Liberal Democrats are the only party to have put forward the £8 billion to plug that gap that the head of the NHS in England has identified, and the only party with that plug costed. The Conservatives have come out recently and randomly pledged an extra 5.5 billion on top of their first 2.5 billion because they realised they were sounding incompetent on the NHS, but they've not funded it. They've not said where it's going to come from. The Liberal Democrats have, and Labour have come out with only 2.5 billion. So much for the party of the NHS. So I think instead of having this disingenuous squabble about 1% here, 1% there, I think it just comes down to whether people are getting treated in A&E and they're getting treated properly in standard wards, and the Liberal Democrats are the only party that will provide the funding to do that.
Thank you, Chris.
Well, I mean, a lot of people have been saying it's not about privatisation as long as the standards are the same at the point of service. But the fact is, it won't be the same as the point of service. When you bring in privatisation, what you bring in is the market forces, and the market forces say we've got to make a profit. How do we make a profit? We make a profit by either cutting services, so we've got less service than we used to pay for, or you cut the wages, you cut people. You can't have a profit and provide the same service at the same time. Privatisation means worse services.
Sorry, Chris, doesn't history actually sort of prove you wrong? Because if that were the case, how come we've got world-beating privately owned companies in the UK? How come all of our cars aren't built by a state-owned company? How come Tesco isn't run by the Department of the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs? Why is it that everything isn't run by the state if privatisation is so terribly evil?
Well, yes. Well, like Lily's trying to say, healthcare is a separate issue. If you want to look at efficiencies of economic scale, we spend almost half per head compared to what America does for a healthcare system which has proven better outcomes. We don't have people in this country who become bankrupt because they had a visit to A&E like you do in America.
No.
Now,
Do you know how many other countries there are in the world like that? I mean, for example, would you like to compare the NHS and potential other structures with those they have in Ireland, France, Australia, Canada? America is obviously the bogeyman, but I don't see any political party at any time, potentially from what Nigel Farage said a few months ago, although his party has said something different. I don't see any party making any suggestion about America being a model. This is a point made by some of our tweeters. Why not compare us to some of those other countries like Ireland or Canada or Australia or Italy or Sweden or Norway? Why is it America? Because no one's proposing that, are they?
Well, there's a huge variety of systems. I mean, like you mentioned Italy. Italy's an interesting one because they spend almost exactly the same per head as we do, but we have far better outcomes than Italy on pretty much every measurable scale. The NHS just delivers very good value as it is. Now, I mean, I want to come back to some of the other points, because the fact is this isn't just about the Conservatives. Labour brought PFI into the healthcare system. We're still paying off massive debts to private companies for hospitals that are now already starting to become ageing. And possibly the worst thing Labour brought in was the internal market. It's become massively inefficient to the NHS, tying it into long contracts, paying well over the odds for things. I mean, when I was trained to be a doctor, the running joke was if someone needed gluten-free bread in hospital, we were paying something like £33 a loaf for it because we had this new internal market where we had to buy things through a contracted provider. Now, I mean, all these kinds of things just don't work with the NHS. The NHS would be far better being run by doctors on the basis of giving the care that people need, not being run for profits, not being run for businesses. The NHS is about people.
Thank you very much indeed, Christopher. Thank you for your comments at home. We're going to move on to our next question now. And this one comes from James at Statism Room 101. How can you guarantee a future energy supply for the UK? When you're answering this, people, I'd like you to remember this is an uncertain world. We have a large neighbour on our continent in Russia who provide a large amount of gas to our neighbours, and we're fairly reliant on some of that and certainly the production from it. How are you going to guarantee future energy supply for the UK? The first person to answer this, thanks to our randomised list, is John.
Yeah, thank you, Gareth. I think everything you said is completely true. Energy supply is becoming a bigger issue as time goes by. In UKIP, we are proposing several things to combat this. Firstly, of course, fracking to ease the demand in the short term and to cut bills. In the long term, we are looking at several different options. Not only nuclear, not only small amounts of renewable energy, but also ways to make the energy market more affordable for people, and perhaps expanding our use of natural resources we have in the UK, perhaps including coal or thermal energy in particular areas where it's appropriate.
Isn't UKIP's policy on this one a little bit confused, John? Because there was a wonderful UKIP leaflet that I saw retweeted by somebody today that had the 2 lines on it. 1, get rid of these dreadful wind farms, and 2, increase our use of reusable energy sources. UKIP opposes many of those resources that we would need to have a long-term energy plan. What use is that to us?
I also saw that leaflet saying it was kind of amusing if you just see it face value. Then, of course, you have to remember that wind farms aren't the only renewable, and in many ways they're probably the least effective renewable. They're much less efficient than solar and hydroelectric. I reject the notion that we are confused on energy and we can't meet a long-term future. We will be setting up a commission as we expand our use of fracking and nuclear, see what is the best course of action for the UK. We are not ruling anything out, hence the leaflet said we would use renewables. But
just not wind farms.
Wind farms are generally not very popular or useful, mainly not useful.
Is there not another problem here? Because UKIP's big international hero seems to be Vladimir Putin, a man who happily cuts off energy supply to some of the coldest countries in Europe. Is that really the person to look up to?
Hero is a strong word.
We'll leave it at that then, shall we? Harry, how can you guarantee a future energy supply for the UK?
I think it's difficult to guarantee anything, but I can tell you what the Lib Dems have done and will do. The Liberal Democrats set up the first green investment bank in history in the world, which invests in green technologies and research and development for alternative energies. We have doubled the amount of energy that comes from green sources. And we are at the forefront of this green surge in the last government, while the Conservatives, I know my Conservative MP down here, told all her constituents that it was our fault that we were having all of this renewable energy coming about. So what the Lib Dems would do in the next government is we would aim for a third of all of British energy to come from renewable sources, which is a very ambitious target, but it's one that needs to be done, and that will be by 2020. We would further our green investment bank and increase further research and development in alternative energies. And here's one that I particularly like as somebody who sort of prefers tax cuts. We would reduce council tax by as much as £100 for green homes. So for energy efficient homes, we would cut people's taxes as an incentive for people to go green themselves. So not only have we
Harry, is that £8 a month cut in council tax? Is that a vow?
Is that a what? Sorry, Gary?
Is that a vow or just a promise? Just trying to establish the strength of it in terms of the Liberal Democrats.
I couldn't make any inference as to what the strength of the promises in our manifesto are, Gareth. But what I would say is that we have a record of investing in green energies and putting them into place, and we want to continue that in the next government.
Thank you. Our next speaker on this is for the Conservatives. It's Leon.
Can I be honest with you?
Of course.
It's hard to actually find a policy. We are committed to shale gas. We're also we agree with what John said with UKIP with fracking in safe areas. We don't agree with the scientific evidence is on our side that it is safe. We are going to put money into renewables, but as I say, I don't think we have a fully formed policy on it yet. But as it said, we do live in an uncertain world, so none of us can really certainly say we can safeguard Britain's energy in the future, realistically.
Christopher.
Well, I disagree with Leon. I don't think fracking is safe. It is safe on paper, but it's not safe when private companies put it into practice. because they cut safety measures. Again, they're trying to make a profit. And what this results in is, you see cases in America where people had water supplies contaminated. There's been an increase in earthquakes in fracking areas. It's simply not a safe procedure, and it's simply not necessary, because the future is renewable power. Now look at Scotland. Scotland is a world leader in wind power. It's a world leader bringing in tidal power.
Is that because of the Scottish Parliament?
It could very well be. Yes, but...
Sorry, carry on.
Okay. I mean, Scotland faces severe challenges in terms of the extra we have to pay to supply to the national grid. But despite that, we've been a massive contributor in terms of getting UK's renewable targets. What we need is more wind farms. We need more investment in tidal power. We need to look at bringing solar in. We're approaching solar grid parity very rapidly now. We're going to be at the point where solar is actually cheaper than coal, and this debate will become pretty much pointless anyway. Everything's going to be solar. That is the future. And that's how the UK gets energy security. We have to be 100% renewable.
Thank you. Lily?
Yes. So the Labour Party's policy on the environment is firstly to have additional powers for the Green Investment Bank, to create 1 million more jobs, and to take a leading role in climate change, because I think under the last government in particular, especially with the influence of the Conservatives, we haven't provided enough impetus for climate change. We're hoping to set up an energy security board to hopefully remove carbon from our electricity supply by 2030, and to tighten regulations for fracking to make sure, if there will be fracking in the future, that it will hopefully be as safe as possible. So,
thank you very much, Lily. A few of the points that, in fact, just one question I want to ask you, Lily, before we move on. Your party leader, the man who would like to be Prime Minister, was directly responsible as Energy Secretary in the previous Labour government for greatly increasing home energy bills in the cause of climate change. Isn't that a real problem for Labour when all that's done is force lots more people into energy poverty?
I don't think that'll be the problem in the future, especially when non-renewable energies are getting a lot cheaper, especially solar energy. Solar energy is becoming a lot more efficient, a lot more cheaper. And I think the problem is, I think the problem, a decade ago when Ed Miliband was the Environment Secretary, is that non-renewables weren't getting enough investment. They weren't cheap as it should be as at the moment. So no, I don't think it will be a problem in the future, Gareth. I think what will be the problem in the future is non-renewables becoming, a lot less efficient than non-renewables, because the supply of non-renewables, gradually decreasing, like oil, for instance.
Thank you very much. A few of the comments that you've made at home about this one. A confident banana at Stradihuvius. I love a tax cut, but lowering council tax for green homes will disproportionately benefit those who can afford to go green. Extending on that point is a confused ninja, Ian, hello Ian, who says that given the increasing number of people renting, council tax cuts won't encourage most landlords to improve the efficiency of their houses. Someone else, Salman, says that he finds your passion for environmental tax breaks infectious, Harry. Where are we? Some people pointing out that our infrastructure, here we are, William Brown, our infrastructure is reaching capacity. What solutions would you provide for increasing our capacity? Josh Page at Josh Pope Inc. How can you not have a policy on environmental energy? He asks. Chairman Meow, Jack Hughes 666, absolutely right. The Conservatives offer no policy on energy usage and supply for the future. And Bradley Booth, being 100% reliant on renewable energies doesn't allow Russia to use cutting off gas supplies as a weapon. Right. Members, what do you think? Anyone want to come in on anything we've talked about so far on energy?
Yeah, can I just address a point Christopher made, and I think Harry did as well, about fracking. We mentioned in the last debate that the American system is often used as a bogeyman to scaremonger us away from particular things that might be bad as well. And it seems they're using the American example of fracking to scare us away from energy security and gas, which I think we'd all want. I live in Leicestershire, which is in the East Midlands. Less than 20 miles away from me, there has been a fracking site operating for 50 years and has so far led to no problems. So I think perhaps instead of completely ruling out a source of energy production because somewhere else it didn't work, perhaps because it was under-regulated or done on a scale we couldn't do here, I think is silly. we are facing an uncertain future. To have a proper energy policy going forward, we need to consider all options. I mean, lots of people within my party are not fans of renewables, don't believe in climate change, what have you.
No way.
No way. Still, within our policy, we are not ruling it out. We are committed to putting forward a wide variety of energy sources. We will be using nuclear, we will be using fracking, but we're not going to exclude things.
Thank you. Chris?
Well, I'm not really going to take very seriously UKIP's position on energy. This is the party whose candidate for Grimsby has said, "Oh, what will we do when renewable energy runs out?" And I think we very much have to say, well, if it's all about energy security into the long-term future, well, fracking can only be a temporary solution anyway. It's still a finite energy source. If we're going to go to be long-term 100% renewable, let's just go be 100% renewable. I mean, the one reason why fracking has kind of worked in America in terms of bringing down prices, at least, is that America has vast swathes of empty land where, even if it causes massive pollution, it's not going to have a direct effect on nearby people. That doesn't happen in the UK. The UK is much more densely populated than the US. If you start fracking around the UK, you're going to be near people's houses. If they have problems with poisoning water supplies, it's going to affect people. This is why we can't have fracking in the UK. It's simply not suitable.
So the one that's been operating for 50 years was just lucky that it didn't poison the nature reserve it's under.
Well, the fact is, we're talking about scales here. We have one little experimental test drilled. That's looking at
apparently it's done enough to power 21,000 homes.
Well, that's the equivalent of a small wind farm. The point is,
every day. Sorry.
Well, this is a matter of what has. This is looking at technology. This comes back to what I said earlier on. It's not the technology that's so much the problem. It's the implementation by companies who start cutting off the safety measures, and it becomes dangerous to implement because they're trying to make a profit. What we should have is, what we want is to have an investment bank. Money from North Sea oil would be invested in long-term infrastructure. We could use this money to fund 100% renewables. Once UK has 100% renewables, we don't need to worry about fracking. We wouldn't need any other power supply. We'd have free renewable energy that wouldn't run out, that wouldn't be reliant on abroad. It would be real energy security for the future.
When you say 100% renewable, what scale are you using? Because I noticed the Scottish wind farms, the maximum capacity they've ever got out of them was less than half. So when you say 100% renewable, are you talking at max capacity, or how much we'd need, which would be a lot more than we should be able to?
Yeah, it has to be average capacity, obviously, or average demand.
So you're still in favour of us importing nuclear energy from the French?
No, I'm not. What we require is much diversity. It's not just a matter of wind power. We need the wind, we need the solar, we need the hydroelectric, we need the tidal. You need to combine that with large capacity programs. We need more falls of Krawakens. We need large biomass and all these other, it's the idea that you need the diversity in the mix. That's what gives you security. But the point is, you don't get security from a finite power supply, and fracking is a finite power supply. What you need is renewables, because renewables, unlike your Grimsby candidate believes, don't run out.
Thank you very much. Let me go to Harry now.
I think to be fair to John, you do need to keep doors open, but I think that in a world that we pretty much know that global warming is happening, we pretty much know that it's man-made. I don't understand why there are some people in your party specifically, John, who are still so opposed to moving away from this traditional gas, oil and coal methods of energy. So fracking, even though it's a new form of getting it out, is still the same fundamental carbon, fossil fuel based energy source. I note that Chris said that we should put money into an investment bank to invest into green and renewable energies. That's what the Liberal Democrats have done in government. As for fracking in itself, it's going to be a new problem and it's going to be a new issue that will face a new government. Personally, I'm against fracking. I think we should be investing far more in renewable resources. But the Liberal Democrats this time round in government have introduced far greater regulation of fracking drills. We've created a provision which means that 50% of the tax profit from the energy produced by fracking has to go to renewable resources, and that when those wells have been finished, they are given at no charge to geothermal research and energy producers. So we, in effect, have legislated that if fracking does happen, and that's a decision that the next government has to make, its net benefit will be that the proceeds of that improve renewable research. But I personally think we should go all out on the renewables. And I think we should make the transition towards a green, clean Britain.
Thank you very much indeed. Harry, a couple of comments we've made before we move on to our next question. Salman Anwar says, haha, well done Chris Keane for that Grimsby quote. Nathaniel Higgins at NethGGNS, has it already been proven that the majority of oil we've already taken out of the ground needs to remain unburned? A confused ninja, more money in researching fusion. It's decades away, but we have to plan decades ahead. A confident banana at Stradihuvius. I think sometimes these names are designed just to get us. UKIP's position on renewable energy and alternative sources is confused as almost everything else about the party. Chris G suggests perhaps you should be in favour of nationalising the energy sector, Chris, based on what you've said. However, Bradley Booth agrees with you. He says, well done. Daryl Devine at the Dasro. Fracking is not terribly safe, I must say. I don't fancy my tap water catching fire. Our next question, this one has been inspired by Vic Johnson at Vic_says, and the question is this. How are we going to house our increasing population, and which of the Lib Dem rent-to-own and the Conservative right-to-buy policies are best for tenants? And the person who's going to open on this one, according to our randomizer, is Harry. You're muted at the moment, Harry.
And now I'm unmuted. Okay, well, I think this was actually one of the reasons. It's no secret that I used to be a Conservative. And this is one of the reasons I left the Conservatives, is because I felt that Conservative policy had nothing to offer young people and instead offered everything to older people. And this was confirmed when I read the manifestos. You see, the problem with right to buy is that it is a good idea in principle, but if you don't have the housing stock that's being built to resupply social housing, you know, it sort of falls apart. It means you have less social housing for the genuinely vulnerable people. And that's just not something that we can support. So what the Liberal Democrats have done is they've come up with something called rent to buy and help to rent. And they're two separate policies in the sort of traditional three named housing policies, which I don't quite understand. But all rent to buy and help to rent do is basically that every time you pay rent on a house, it is effectively a mortgage by default. Every time you pay rent on a house, you get a greater share of that house until down the line you have paid for it and you have the opportunity to own it. It means we don't create housing bubbles, which caused the problem in the first place, and which the Conservatives Help to Buy continues to do. It means that young people get a chance at home ownership of their own by paying fair amounts, not reduced, not cut down in the market, and not threatening social housing stocks. And it's just a generally more equitable approach to housing policy in this country. I believe that we should invest a lot more into social housing as well, and I think the problem is decidedly supply side rather than demand side, like UKIP and Nigel Farage do, just blaming the next immigrant.
Thank you very much. Well, we go straight now to John.
I find it surprising Harry often plays the man, not the ball in these debates. Instead of blaming immigrants, UKIP has come up with a very sensible housing policy. We are cutting costs for building new houses on brownfield site. Our current aim is to build 200,000 houses a year during the next government. I mean, that's hardly blaming people, that's offering a positive move forwards. As well as this, in our manifesto, we're talking about not only protecting the Greenbelt, but helping people build and buy new houses. As well as this, we're putting a tax in place on empty houses, as we've always believed that home ownership is very important, and in our current housing crisis, it's almost unfair to allow people to amass empty properties while everyone else needs somewhere to live. So I think to say we're attacking people is problematic. I mean, I'm not going to deny that we are addressing the problem of immigration has on our housing market. It's silly to suggest that net immigration of 300 and something thousand a year won't affect our housing prospects when we have, the lowest level of house building for 40 years. At the same time, we're not just attacking people, and we're not blaming them. No one is blaming people for wanting to come here. But we are offering positive policies and addressing the fact we need to slow population growth so we can give everyone a house and make sure they have the right standards of living.
Thank you. Our next speaker on this then, Lily.
Yeah. First of all, I agree with a lot of Harry says. Actually, I think the problem with the Conservatives is that under this government in particular, there has been a rising problem of a housing bubble, and what the Conservatives are planning to do is actually make the problem even worse. We've had the slowish startup of houses. I think it's the 1920s actually, John. So we need to start building houses. We need to. Right to buy is a completely wrong approach, in my opinion. You're forcing councils to sell their property at below price, and you're not really replacing them. I mean, it sounds, completely stupid. We shouldn't have. I can understand, the idea of right to buy, but as Harry says, the problem is you need to be able to replace those council housing, and that's simply not happening at the moment. We need to start building homes again. Labour Party have promised to start building 200,000 homes a year. We can't fuel this housing bubble and increase demand. We need to solve the supply side, which I personally think the Labour Party have the right approach to this.
Part of the issue, though, Lily, is it came as a surprise to everyone the other night, perhaps not to everyone, but most people, that the Conservative Liberal coalition have built more council houses in their 5 years than Labour did in 13. Is this not like the energy policy yet again? Labour trying to make up for the mistakes it made in government?
Again, you're making the same mistake, Gareth. You're pointing out the problems of the last Labour government and saying, "Oh, Lily, don't you support this?" No, of course I don't. Labour should have built many, many more houses. It was unacceptable. We should have built more houses in the last government. We shouldn't have had PFI in the last government. We shouldn't have spent as much in the last government. We shouldn't have gone to Iraq in the last government. I can go on and on and on and on, Gareth. But the point is, Labour should have built more houses in the last government. But that doesn't contradict my basic premise that the Conservatives haven't built enough houses under this government, and they're going to make it even worse under Help to Buy. It doesn't contradict my point, Gareth.
Thank you very much. Leon.
You'll all be happy to know I've actually done some reading on this. Our housing policy, everybody knows, one of the more major policies, extending right to buy scheme to housing association in England. I'm very much in support of this policy, and I think it comes down to a point of principle, really. I think it's possibly because I grew up in a council house myself, and I remember the pride that my mum and dad had when they were able to buy their first house, and I think it's quite nice to let people do that. On the topic of whether or not the rent to own is a better idea, I tell you, it's not actually a bad idea. But I was chatting to a very good Lib Dem friend of mine. He's actually said he prefers the right to buy scheme because it's tested. We know it's not as bad, and the only reason, the initial right to buy under Thatcher didn't work because there were more homes being sold off than there were being built. I think that's a generally accepted point. So what we want to do is we want to again build more houses, as you've already said. Right to buy and selling off council houses doesn't work if you don't have then more supply of council houses. Well, that's what we're going to do. 200,000 homes built to first-time buyers as well. I think it's fantastic. We also want to look at regenerating brownfield sites so that we can have 400,000 more homes as well.
Thank you very much indeed. Our last speaker on this is Christopher.
I won't surprise you that I think Right to Buy was a disaster. What it has given us is a transfer of 40% now of the council housing really sold off. It's in the hands of private landlords. Leon says, "Oh, it's good for people to own their own home." Well, that's not what's happening. What was happening is a large-scale transfer of assets to private landlords that they can make profit off people most needy of a home in society, because we haven't replaced these houses with new social housing. It's new social housing we need because people can't afford to rent anymore. The rent's too damn high. And it's a case of, I don't see how the Lib Dems rent to own policy is going to help that. Because if you look at that, it's going to just have it's going to be increasing more demand. And again, if houses are getting sold off, then the rents will be even higher for people that still can't afford to buy. The Help to Rent will just increase demand. That means higher prices. None of this will help. What you need to fix there's too much demand, so you need more supply. We have to build council houses. We have to you look back at the 60s, we used to build new towns. We had massive council schemes. This just doesn't happen anymore. And that means that of course we're trapped in like a system whereby there's not going to be enough housing. It doesn't matter. John goes on about, well, immigrants are taking houses. Well, if we built enough houses, that wouldn't be a problem. It's about supply. Fix the supply issue. Build new houses.
What's the SNP done about it? Because it is a devolved issue, isn't it? So what's happened?
Yeah, well, while Labour were in charge of the Scottish Parliament for 8 years, they built a grand total of 6 council houses. I think they were off in the Shetland Islands or something. The 8 years that the SNP have been in power, we've built 30,000. So I think it's a fairly good percentage increase.
If there are any mathematicians out there who can tell us what that percentage increase is, we'd be very grateful. Anyone else want to comment on this so far?
Yeah.
After Harry.
Leon spoke about his friend, his Liberal Democrat friend, who prefer right to buy to rent to own. And of course he would. Who wouldn't prefer a pretty instantaneous cut price house? But it is a nice idea. But the problem is that nice ideas left sort of untended to can cause housing bubbles, and housing bubbles cause massive great recessions that we're still feeling the effects of across the world today. So I actually agree with Christopher. I think we should build lots more houses, and that's why the Liberal Democrats have committed to 10 new garden cities. It's why the Liberal Democrats have committed to new towns and villages across a new garden line linking Oxford and Cambridge. It's why we've committed to introducing a new housing investment bank to increase capital available for affordable housing. It's why we're streamlining the grant system. I could go on. We believe in the need not only to access the housing market more easily for younger people, but we also agree that there is a massive need for more housing generally. So the Liberal Democrats want to make it easier for young people to access housing, and we want more affordable housing in total. That's something the Conservatives simply would not do.
Can I just ask a question?
Yes, certainly, go on.
I must have missed something. Who has said that we shouldn't build more houses?
Nobody said we shouldn't. I just haven't seen the plan.
Nobody said we shouldn't at all. So I think when people keep saying, "Oh well, it's the supply that's the," but everybody knows it's the supply, and all parties have policies to try and deal with the supply. It's not like.
What's your policy, Leon?
It's not actually. I've just told you.
And to be fair, Harry, I think this government, the coalition government, passed the Act back in 2010, which changed quite dramatically the planning system, and was supposed to, including the new homes bonus, and was supposed to transform and greatly increase the number of houses that were built. Now that was joint policy between the Lib Dems and the Conservatives. Why hasn't it worked?
Well, I think because the supply element of any economy is in the long run. There is a lag between legislation coming into effect and its effects being seen. But the problem is you need to sustain this. We have a huge problem that's not going to be solved by simply one piece of legislation a few years ago. We have the plan. I've outlined a few of the elements. The reason I'm saying it is because I haven't heard plans from the other parties and from their representatives here.
Okay, can anyone like to come in on this one and tell me, because the people who give permission for housing developments are local councils, it's local planning authorities. The last big change in the law that took place a couple of years ago made it easier for developers to get permission for house building. What are each of you going to do about it? Because so far everyone, as Leon actually just pointed out, everyone has said they believe we should have more housing. How are you actually going to make sure it's delivered? Surely you're going to have to take control away from local councils to ensure they can't block development in their areas.
If I could
John.
address this. I think the problem with this is, as housing is involved this year, I think we should just talk about, I'm just going to talk about England in this situation because I don't live in Scotland or Wales. I think there are two ways to address this. Firstly, the supply problem is obviously the biggest, and I think the problem with the last proposals and the control of local councils is lots of this housing development was going to be built in the green belt in small, less populated areas where the local councils were elected by people who would rather die than have another town turn up next to them. So I think there are two ways to address this. Firstly, there are approximately 300,000 empty properties in the UK. Taxing those to encourage them to be developed, something I think all local councils would be on board with, developing rundown areas within disused buildings within their area of authority would be very popular. And secondly, investment on brownfield sites. I mentioned the brownfield revolution at the start, but extra money, cutting taxes, to developing in areas that perhaps were less popular to build on and would consequently have less resistance to being built on, I think is the way forward. Also, though, I mean, we talk a lot about supply, and supply is obviously the bigger issue here, but I can't ignore demand. If we have net immigration at 350,000, that's 350,000 people needing houses. So to say it's just supply is not the entire picture. There is a supply and demand issue, and without addressing demand by slowing our population growth, it won't help just saying supply. Because we've all said we will build 200,000 homes, we will build 300,000 homes. Net immigration last year was 347,000, so that's supply gone. So what would their answer be to that?
Okay, thank you. Anyone got a 10-second answer or comment they want to make on housing before we move to our final question of tonight's debate?
Immigration is not a problem. We just need to build more houses.
You said 200,000. I told you there was 347 net immigration, so that's your plan gone.
Yours is assuming that people don't ever live together, though, I think, John, if you look at those numbers. Right. Anyone else want a 10-second comment on this before we move on to our final question?
Nobody has said that we shouldn't build houses, and I think really, Harry, you need to go and read the manifestos if you think that we're not talking about building houses and whatnot. As someone has very kindly pointed out on Twitter, Tories don't just have a record of promising to build houses, they actually have a record of building houses throughout the 20th century.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much for your comments. Here is our final question. Before I go to it, you will find over at spectrumdebates.com now the post-show poll where you can vote for who you think performed best tonight. Our record so far is almost 700 votes. Let's see what we come up with this week. Our final question comes from Joe Pattinson. That's Joe_Pattinson, and it's this: what is the most essential policy to secure Britain's future? And the first person to answer it will be someone who objects to the nature of the question itself. Christopher.
Yes, I'm not going to answer the question. I'm not going to answer the question literally because I don't think Britain should have a future politically or constitutionally. I think the most important policy from the SNP manifesto in this election is that we must get rid of Trident. It's obscene that we're spending £100 billion on nuclear weapon replacement when we have a country where 1 million people are dependent on food banks, where we have unemployment and poverty. Why do we need £100 billion of weapons we can never use? Is it just a part of trying to maintain some sort of global clout? Is this some kind of remnant of imperialist desire? I don't know, but it's a matter of simple economics that we can't afford these weapons, and that's why are we wasting money on something utterly pointless and useless? There's so much other things we could do with that money. Imagine how many hospitals we could open, how many nurses we could hire, how many teachers we could hire. All of these things we could do for £100 billion, but no, all these other parties in this debate want to go spend it on nuclear weapons. Well, I say no, and my red line for any coalition that happens after this election is that there can be no Trident replacement.
Just one point, Chris. Surely the SNP have said they will only consider any sort of pact or deal or coalition with Labour. Therefore, actually, haven't you just sort of handed in your ability to negotiate at all? Because the Labour Party, in need of colleagues, know the only chance the SNP would get of directly influencing government is with them. So you've given away your chance of negotiating anything, including Trident, because they can say, take it or leave it.
I don't agree, Gareth, because what we've promised to do is lock the Tories out of power. Now, that doesn't mean we have to support any kind of Labour policies if they won't do a deal with us. Perhaps it'll end up in a situation where Westminster's totally deadlocked. Well, I don't know. The SNP will carry on ruling Scotland from Holyrood. In terms of, we're not the Lib Dems. We're not here just to facilitate some larger parties' policies. We have red lines, and if no party is going to work with us, well, we won't work with any other party. Thank
you. Harry?
I think the most important area for the future of the country is education. And I think the Liberal Democrat record and the Liberal Democrat plans for the future are the only plans that will secure that educational future for our children and for the future generations. So, for example, our introduction of the pupil premium in government, our introduction of the pilot scheme to give all 4 and 5-year-olds free school meals, I think they are vital building blocks for the next government. But the Liberal Democrats next time would introduce national colleges as centres for excellence for vocational training in certain areas, such as the renewable energy sector. We want to double the amount of businesses offering apprenticeships. We want to increase our early years pupil premium, so targeting children right at the start of school to £1,000 per disadvantaged pupil. We want to make sure that all teachers in schools have qualified teacher status. And I think it really comes down to the fact that education is this wonderful tool for combating against the social ills, so inequality, poverty, social injustice. And I think investment in education, as we have pledged to ring-fence education funding right through from early years to 19, is absolutely vital. And I think it's the only way that we will create a fairer society and a stronger economy in the future.
I think there's 3 cheers there for the excellent use of a manifesto slogan. Quick question for you here on this one, Harry. Obviously, I asked for a policy. You gave me several, but you captured in terms of it being education. Mm-hmm. Is this perhaps the Lib Dems trying too hard? Because after all, the one thing that you'll be remembered for in government is that broken vow on education in relation to university tuition fees. Is anybody going to believe you?
We throw our hands up. Yes, we did go back. Well, not all of the party, but half of the party went back on their pledge. One of the reasons we went back on that is because the report, which suggested raising tuition fees, which was supported by Labour before it was even released and committed to by the Conservatives, would have lifted the cap entirely on tuition fees, unlimited tuition fees. And it was Liberal Democrats in government who created not only a fairer system for repaying them, but also just raised the cap to 9,000. So yes, we have apologised for going back on our pledge, but fundamentally believe that we have a fairer fee system in place. And we reiterate that education is the core of liberalism in empowering the least empowered to go on and be able to do what they need to do to make this country better.
Thank you very much. Lily, what's the most important policy for Britain's future?
Matthew Holbert would be really proud of you tonight, Harry. I think one of the most important things for the future, Gareth, would be the economy. We need to deal with the deficit. £90 billion for our budget deficit. We need to get on control of that. We need to invest in our young people, which is linked with our economy, make sure they have the skills available to have the jobs that businesses need. We need to cut taxes for small businesses, but also asking big corporations to pay the way for the deficit. We need an economy, Gareth, that works for everyone, where we have rising living standards, where we have fair taxes, and dealing with the deficit. So I can understand completely why Harry chose education. That's vitally important as well. But from my perspective, Gareth, with the deficit, with growth, with living standards, with jobs, and the environment, I think the economy is 100% the most essential policy in securing our future.
And isn't the problem for Labour on the economy, Lily, that over the last 5 years, the Labour Party has time and time again refused to set out in any detail what it would do differently from the coalition? So I come back to the point I made at the start. You've agreed that it's the most important thing, but as the IFS said, nobody knows economically what they're voting for if they vote Labour, do they?
Well, of course they know what we're going to do. We're going to increase the minimum wage. We're going to have a zero-based review. We're going to increase apprentices. Of course they know what we're doing, Gareth. I can understand the problem with all parties, Gareth, is that no political party that wants to eliminate the deficit they don't reveal everything. So it's not just us. The Conservatives, they're not going to tell us the £25 billion in tax cuts. They're not going to tell us about the £12 billion in welfare cuts, which could actually hurt the disabled. So I would make the point that I can understand what you're saying, but in many ways it's the case for all parties as well, Gareth.
Thank you. John, what's your most important policy for the future of Britain? Now, I'm going to write down what I think you're going to say, but do tell us.
I'm not going to say the EU.
There I go.
It would be very easy for me as a UKIP member to say that, but having read our manifesto, I think the most important policy we can put forward this election is political reform. I mean, the political reform section of our manifesto is huge. I mean, for years we were the single issue party, and I could play into that and talk about the EU forever. But, I mean, going through our manifesto of citizens' initiative, right of recall, open primaries, confirmation hearings, expenditure hearings, voting reform, these are currently in the UK. We're living through a time of political crisis. Politically, the UK has never been more divided. Attendance at all kinds of elections is going down. People feel disconnected from their politics. And I think to ensure the entire UK's future, the best thing we can do is voting reform and political reform. Not only regionalism with English votes for English laws, but a new voting system so people feel engaged, and people's power over their MPs. So it's not just once every 5 years people get a say, it's much more than that.
Thank you. Interesting point you've just made there, and you've given some ideas of detail from the UKIP manifesto. And I'm going to come back to the point I raised with you at the very start about UKIP. You talk about believe in Britain, but aren't most of those ideas essentially just ripping off the role of Congress in the USA? Is this not trying to create America Light? Is that what it's really about? And if these things really mattered, why didn't your two MPs actually put themselves through a primary, even an internal party primary, when they were wanted to stand for Parliament again? Instead, they kicked out people who'd been already selected by UKIP, standing Clacton and Rochester, haven't they?
I would point out that one, that was pre this manifesto, and two, they were by-elections where the National Executive Committee can say things. On your point about America, though, America is a country founded on principles of liberty and control over the various mechanisms of government. So I think having our government become more accountable and having given people more of a direct say is not a bad thing. If we do get called America Light, if that policy does get called America Light, I'm not going to complain too much.
Thank you very much. And the final most important policy is going to come from Leon.
First things first, I hate that question because that's really hard to answer, actually. But I'm going to strengthen the view of Lib and Lab all being the same by saying I agree with Lily on what's most important, but not on how we sort it out, obviously. I do think the economy, the deficit and the debt are going to be the most important things for now, so that we can get the nation's finances back on track. I think our long-term economic plan is what will get us back on track. It is working, and I think as long as we carry on down the right road, I think it will continue to work.
Okay, well, I'm going to come back to you on the point I raised at the start as well, because the Conservatives have spent 5 years trying to claim this mantle of being the economically competent party. But surely people are entitled to now worry. Can they even believe you on that when you are handing out cash left, right and centre in this general election campaign? Hasn't all that energy and all that time trying to persuade people that you are one thing just now been completely thrown on the bonfire by splashing cash around that you can't even identify?
No, I don't think it is. I think because we've made the necessary cuts that we've made, and we've increased the tax take as well, I think it means that we are able to afford some of the necessary extra spending plans that we're committed to. I don't think there's anything wrong with saying that the government can spend a bit of money. There's nothing wrong as long as it's controlled and it's not splashing out. I don't think we are splashing out. But yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask each of our guests in a moment just to give a final 30-second summary. Why should you vote for them? And they are literally only going to have 30 seconds, and I'm going to time them. In the meantime, thank you all very much for watching and joining in. Don't forget you can go to our website at spectrumdebates.com, and on there you will find the poll to decide who you think has been the best debater from tonight's show. One other thing. Over the next couple of months, there are a few Sundays I know I'm not around for. If you would be interested not only in appearing on this panel in future, but taking this role and presenting the show, please do get in touch. I already have one willing victim, David, who did it last week, and I thought did a superb job. If you'd be interested in doing so, please do get in touch. There'll be some dates in May, June and July where I'm after people to take over this seat. So here we go. Final 30 seconds. Each of you please tell us why should people vote for you? And the first one is Harry.
Fairness, justice and opportunity. These are the three values that the Liberal Democrats stand for. I've explained, the Liberal Democrats have made mistakes in government. We're one of the only parties who've held our hands up and said sorry for the biggest ones of those. But we want more. We want more from this country. We want more fairness, more justice, more opportunity. We want increased funding for mental health. We want digital bill of rights, better education, a greener country. Only the Liberal Democrats can offer that.
And with 2 seconds to spare, well done, thank you very much indeed. Our next speaker is John. John, why should people vote UKIP?
Thank you very much. Hope you've seen some positive views of the UKIP manifesto here. You should vote for UKIP mainly because we are offering something different. We're offering reform in many areas, we're offering fair policies, and we're offering strength both at home and abroad. Through this debate, we've seen lots of people who are very passionate about their parties say lots of different things, but what we've also seen is similarity, and hopefully I've convinced you that UKIP can offer something quite different. Believe in Britain, believe in UKIP, plain speaking patriots.
And another 2 seconds to go. That's very much like the Lib from the LibLabCon that you just followed with the 2 seconds there. Our third speaker to tell us why we should vote, in this case for the SNP, is Chris. So tell us, Chris. Well, I would say that, but of course what I've gone and done is I've gone and reset my clock, so it doesn't even have 30 seconds.
Oh, Gareth.
I know, it's awful, isn't it? Here we go. Are you ready? Why should we vote SNP? Go.
You've heard from the other parties tonight. They talk about the economy. What they mean is they're going to bring in more cuts. If you're against cuts, if you're against austerity, if you want to get rid of Trident, you have to vote for something different from the old parties. If you're in Scotland, please vote SNP. If you're in Wales, vote Plaid Cymru. If you're in Cornwall, vote maybe in Cornell. If you're in England, I think you should probably vote Green, but just go out there and vote. Vote for something different. It's time to bring change to Westminster.
Another 2 seconds. This is a conspiracy, ladies and gentlemen. It's gone beyond the LibLabCon. We've currently got the LibKip Snup conspiracy on time. 30 seconds, our penultimate speaker, it's Lily. Lily, tell us in 30 seconds, why should people vote Labour?
Because quite frankly, the Labour Party, the only serious party about eliminating the deficit. You've heard tonight that the Conservatives are going to have £25 billion of tax cuts, which they don't know how they're going to fund. You're going to have 12 billion cuts in welfare. The Labour Party, the only serious party about increasing living standards, changing our economy so it works for working people throughout the country. And yeah, vote Labour.
There's someone trying to break the consensus. Did it in a little over 20 seconds. Well done, Lily. Our final guest then, Leon. 30 seconds. Why should people vote Conservative?
Interestingly, I wrote down in my notes that I hope I've given you a good reason to vote Conservative. Lol. Honestly, think carefully before when you go to the ballot box about who you're going to vote for. Are you going to vote for competence or chaos? If you want competence, vote Conservative. If you want chaos, vote Labour.
And even more short and sweet, I think we worked out where the coalition was tonight, and it wasn't with the Lab or the Con. And I seem to have gone orange. The room has turned into a sauna. That's the joy of the mobile. Thank you all very much indeed for joining us. We'll be back next week with a normal show. A couple more before we get to the election. It will, of course, be focused on that election. You have, if you haven't for some reason registered to vote, you have until tomorrow to do so. Tomorrow is your final day. So get people down to their council, get them online, get them to register to vote. And then, of course, hopefully on May the 7th, get them out to vote. It's the participation thing that we're very much interested in here. Thank you all very much indeed. It's a big thank you to my guests. Thank you to Harry and to John and to Christopher and to Leon and to Lily. Thank you all very much indeed. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Good night.
Good night.
All right.